My name is Deborah Apeloig. I am the founder and host of the podcast Tikkun Talks, where we hold meaningful conversations about Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Today, I am representing 3G Miami. 3G stands for the third generation. We are a group of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors with the mission of educating students about the perils of intolerance by sharing our grandparents' stories of survival. I am excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with Tom Weidlinger, who is the writer, producer, and director from both the book and the movie Restless Hungarian, which is premiering at this festival. And thank you all for joining us. So thank you, Tom, for being here with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
As a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, while I was watching the film, I felt a deep connection with the story and the way you convey it. I especially enjoyed how you use your father's genius drawings to connect us viewers to the narrative. So thank you for that. And I would like to start with the first question by quoting one of your closing remarks. And you say, "I believe there is a purpose in descending into the depths of the past and befriending the sorrowful souls that still dwell there in our hearts." Can you tell us more about that purpose and what you wish to achieve with this film?
Well, I'm glad you started with that because that's really kind of sums up the purpose of the film. And I think that that it's very possible not to know where we come from. And for a long time, I didn't know where I came from. And I think for a long time, maybe I didn't even want to know where I came from. My father certainly didn't, because he never admitted that he was a Jew. So there's a way of really going deeply into family history and encountering these souls who are part of us. And in order to do that, I had to go outside of the relationship of father and son, and talked to a lot of people who knew my father as a man in the world, and also my other relatives. And there's a way of in which doing this process I felt was healing for me, and by getting close to these people and trying to imagine what the world looked like through their eyes in the time and place that they lived. And I guess that was especially true of my parents, because I really hated my father when I was growing up. I disagreed with him politically. I didn't respect him.
And so you said, I really hated
him as a teenager. Wow. Yeah.
Okay.
And I only learned that he was a Jew when I was in my 40s. And it was only many years later that I began to investigate that story. And in learning what he didn't tell me about his life, about the things that were missing in his narrative of his life, I came to understand him and appreciate him in a way that I hadn't when he was alive. And the same thing was true for my mother. So it was actually quite difficult work to do psychologically, but it was, I think, a very important journey.
I can totally understand that. Yes, I mean, it looks like it was a deep, how do you say, healing journey, and a way for you to reconcile many traumas and relationships with your mother and your father.
Yeah. And my hope is that it's a journey that resonates for other people, because, one could say, well, do you just make films for, your own psychological healing? I hope that it does resonate for second and third generation Holocaust survivors.
Well, it certainly resonated with me.
Good.
For sure. And I wanted to, what you said about your relationship, father-son, gives a perfect segue for my next question, which is, we can see this as an autobiography for yourself and for your ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did you manage to work with those two roles, being the son and also being the storyteller, and having your personal, very emotional hat on, and then the professional filmmaker hat on as well?
Well, that's an excellent question. It was very difficult. In writing the book, my father lived an incredible life before I was ever born. He had all these adventures, and I set out to make a film about this man and tell the story of his life. And it was, and I'm trained as a journalist, as a documentary filmmaker, and I've always believed that one is humble before their topic, and that you don't intrude yourself into the story, and that was fine to do for the part of his life up until I was born. And then I think I say at the beginning of the film that it was an easy project until I was born, and then it got complicated because I became part of the story.
Of course.
And I really resisted becoming part of the story. And if it weren't for a group of advisors that I convened to watch a rough cut of the film and a subsequent fine cut, who said, you really have to put yourself in the story. And I said, do I really? They said, yes, you really have to do that. And so I did. And if I hadn't done that, you wouldn't be saying this film is autobiographical, because it was a completely different film in its earlier stages.
I can totally understand the process, because I'm going through something very similar. And yes, I think it's great that you used your advisor's advice, because it makes it much more relatable. So would you say, the subject is Restless Hungarian. So your father is the main character, according to the title. But,
yeah.
And your father and your mother, there's all these secondary characters, but I think I see you as the main character. What do you say about that?
I'm okay with that. I think everybody relates to a film differently. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't argue with you about that, but other people who, see the film, who are interested in Paul Weidlinger, the famous structural engineer. I recently did a screening at a modernist gallery devoted to modernist architecture in London, and a lot of people there were interested in the architecture. So he was the hero of the story. Yes, it really depends where you're coming from.
Right. I was seeing it with a lens of more of the psychological background. So maybe that's why I saw it like that. So what you just said about your father being such an important figure in the construction guild in the United States and worldwide, you say that he believed in the message of, and I'm quoting, modern architecture is built to the measure of man, so that man could save the world.
Mm-hmm. That wasn't his quote. It was a kind of credo that that young modernists had. I guess there was the Bauhaus movement, and there was Le Corbusier, and they were kind of rejecting structures, classical architecture, structures that was ornamented, that took references from past times, and the belief was that to really be honest, you had to create buildings, artifacts, where their beauty followed the function, form followed function, where the beautifully was in the way they functioned. So modern architecture didn't have ornamentation. It didn't have cornices and, fake columns and stuff like that. It was all about, you should be able to see, looking at a building, how it was built, and that was the beauty of it. So, that was a pretty grand statement that architecture can save the world. But these guys believed it. That experiment had some disastrous consequences, some good consequences, and also some disastrous ones. And I think, housing projects in the United States and around the world are one of the consequences of that. But there was also good stuff that came out of it.
Right. Yeah. I saw that your father was involved in pretty eye-pleasing projects, especially the Giovata Church. I would say that was my favorite in terms of design.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell how architecture can save the world in terms of making buildings and structures that inspire and that allow humankind to be in inspiring spaces.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So focusing on the main character, your father, Paul Weidlinger. So you said that you learned that your father was Jewish in your 40s, right? Can you share a little more about your upbringing in terms of religious and spiritual reference and environment? And after all of this process that you have gone through in writing and producing Restless Hungarian, how do you define your identity today?
Okay, there's really two parts to that.
Yes.
My parents were atheists, and they were, I think of them as kind of European intelligentsia. They, for me, for my father, intelligence was the most important quality in a human being, an intelligence of a certain kind. So he was a brilliant man. He was a genius, but he lacked emotional intelligence, and I think that's because that part of him had been scarred, had been cauterized, really starting quite early on with the death of his mother when he was 4 years old. But I suspect also that though he never spoke about it, he knew about everything that happened to the rest of the family during the Holocaust, and I think he carried the weight of that. So I think that he was a person who was divided from himself, and in terms of what how that affected my upbringing, it was important that I get a good education. Things of the mind were celebrated, but I had to find my own spiritual path. And when I was a teenager, I went to a Quaker school, which didn't turn me into a Quaker, but it had a significant influence on me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, now I after I discovered that I was Jewish, it did not suddenly make me want to start going to the synagogue. But it kind of explained a lot of things about my family. And I had this feeling of, okay, I belong to this tribe. And there, particularly when I went to Hungary to visit relatives there, even though they were not religious Jews, there was a sense of actually finding a family that I belonged to, which I had never had. And to answer the last part of your question, I do have a spiritual practice, but it's it doesn't fall into any category.
Religion. Okay.
Any religion. Yeah.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And did you know anything about Judaism? Did you have Jewish friends? Did you grow up near any Jewish community before knowing that you were Jewish?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, we spent summers on Cape Cod, the house on Cape Cod. It plays an important role in the film, and there was a whole community of Central and Eastern European immigrants who were engineers, architects, scientists, who had summer places in the same area, and they would have cocktail parties, and 90% of them were Jews, and 90% of them denied, never spoke about it. It was completely a hidden fact. And I for the film, I interviewed some children of these people, and they had very similar experiences about discovering late in life that their parents were Jewish, and yet the culture was Jewish, but it was never acknowledged, if that makes any sense.
It does.
Yeah.
And that brings me to an interesting point of seeing things in terms of the latest thing we've seen in the media and the news, a lot of anti-Semitic remarks, mostly by Ye, and one of his claims is that the Jews control the media, right? And I recently heard from a former someone that is in the 3G group with me, that her great grandparents immigrated before the Holocaust to the US, and they were the pioneers in Hollywood. So it's like a way of responding. The Jewish people have been pioneering the media industry and the filmmaking industry, and that is also a way to save lives, because they received their family members that were fleeing the Nazis and the invasion. So what would you have to say about that?
Well, two things come to mind. Is there's a historical connection and also a personal connection. The historical connection is that in Hungary, Jews played a very important role in sort of bringing the nation into the 20th century. They were, in the 19th century, they were relatively unencumbered by laws and pogroms, and had free access to the Hungarian educational system. And they took full advantage of it, and they became professionals, lawyers, doctors, journalists, musicians, actors, the whole spectrum. And, the population of Hungary at the beginning of the 20th century was 85% illiterate serfs who are just living in poverty, a small aristocracy of about landholding aristocracy of about 5%. And then in between them were the Jews, who had no aristocratic status, but who were the kind of engineers of the modern world, the 20th century. that worked great until the end of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, in which Hungary lost 70% of its landmass as a result of the treaty. So a lot of displaced people who had been living in, Transylvania and what is now Slovakia, and came back to Budapest looking for jobs. And there was this backlash against the Jews who, were doing pretty well. And as a result of that, the Hungarian government passed this Numerus Clausus Act, which basically limited the number of students that could go to university of a specific ethnic group. So because the Hungarians were overrepresented by their numbers, they were barred from university, which is why my father and his classmates had to go study abroad. And, I think there's some sort of parallels one can see. On a personal level, when I found out that I was Jewish, I asked my cousin, who's in the film Pal, I said, so, you're not a practicing religious Jew, do you identify as a Jew? And he said, I will identify as a Jew as long as there is anti-Semitism in the world. And I said, I'm with you on that. Thank you for that.
Do you think that sharing your journey related with mental health and your family's journey can help others heal and can impact positively within their own struggles?
Yeah. Well, I think that, certainly, for my family, in the time of my mother and father, talking about mental health issues was taboo. It was something to be ashamed of. And I think it's highly significant that in the end of the film, when I visit my sister's grave, her full name and her son's name are not on the gravestone.
Right.
And so that's an indication of that. I think to talk about these things and to bring them out in the open, I hope makes it more possible for other people to do that. It's that simple.
It is. It is important to talk openly about mental health, and I think we are going in a good direction. I also agree that it has been taboo for so long, and it's important to open up our own stories and our own struggles so that others can be inspired by them. I was definitely inspired by yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for joining us and for inspiring us by sharing your journey and that of your ancestors. Once again, thank you to all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers for participating in the Miami Jewish Film Festival.